Alas, our microphone is stuck. So the scripture for this morning comes from the prophet Jonah, chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, and we're continuing the story, and this is the second in a three-part series. If you're looking in if you're looking in a Pew Bible, you can find it in the Old Testament on page 579. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, "Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you." So Jonah set out and he went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly large city. It was 3 days to walk across it. And Jonah began to go into the city. Jonah went a day's walk in, and he cried out, 40 more days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on a sackcloth. Then the news reached the king of Nineveh. He rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with a sackcloth, and sat in ashes. Then he had a proclamation made in Nineveh. "By the decree of the king and his nobles, no human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste a thing. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish." When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed God's mind about the calamity that was going to be brought upon them. And it didn't happen. Amen. So Jonah left us in suspense last week as he was swallowed up within the belly of this fish. And of course, this is only after he has done a pretty good job of running away from God, hopping in a boat, and then having himself cast out into the sea before the ocean could consume the entire boat and its crew. Upon entering the fish's digestive tract, Jonah begins to sing a song of thanksgiving and hope, which really, that doesn't seem like Jonah would do based on the other things that we've seen Jonah do. It's a dramatic shift from the way things were going, but let's be real. Jonah has had some life-changing events in these last 72 hours. And so this is where God again appeals to Jonah as he is lying on the beach somewhere covered in fish grossness. It's a dignifying picture that is presented of Jonah. You can almost smell the scent of fish and despair. God once again attempts to reach out to Jonah. "Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh." "Nineveh?" "Yeah, Nineveh." So Jonah says, "Fine. If it's either being slowly digested alive in the stomach of a fish or a quick death in Nineveh, let's do Nineveh." He continues his journey, and the fish helped him get back on track. As he's walking, he can see some shapes out in the distance. It must be some mountains, he thought to himself. As Jonah gets closer, step by step, he begins to see that the shapes, they're man-made structures. It is a massive city that awaits him. The intimidation of his people is manifested in the sheer breadth of the walls of their city that stretch as far as he can see. Jonah entertains the idea of quitting again right there, but he takes a deep breath. He is reminded of God's presence and God's persistence by the stench of the fish that still follows him. He steps through the gate at Nineveh, and he is taken aback at the vast layout of the city. He walks up to one of those standing kiosk maps, and he sucks in his breath. "You are here," it says. Jonah's frustration once again begins to bubble up as he realizes that it's going to take him 3 days to get across Nineveh. Why couldn't have God snatched me up on some awesome giant flying eagle and dropped me off where I needed to go? Jonah thought, well, probably because God thinks this is part of my journey. Jonah gets about a day's walk into this big city. Maybe some folks were rude to him. Maybe he got lost in the food court. Or maybe he just remembers the horrible things that these people had done to himself and his folk. Whatever the reason, Jonah reaches his breaking point. That's it, Jonah cries out in the middle of the marketplace. I'm not going any farther. You terrible people. It's not as if you're going to listen to me anyways. Listen now to the word of the Lord. And this is the entire sermon right here. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And then he drops the mic and he walks away. Jonah does a 180, hastily begins to make his way back out of this terrible place. It's quiet at first. There's a lot of blank stares as if to say, who's this Hebrew guy? But as Jonah gets out of the market, murmurs begin to rise amongst the people. He gets about a quarter mile away from where he had made his proclamation, from his not so passionate declaration, and he can hear people talking about some Hebrew dude and his prophetic message from God. A few more feet away, and he is confronted with men and women in tears. Serves them right, Jonah thinks to himself. They should be scared of this terrible fate that awaits them. At least I didn't come here for nothing. Maybe when I get out of town, I can sit up on that hill and watch the meteor storm that's going to wipe them out. As Jonah passes these folks in tears, he overhears their conversation. They're not crying because they're afraid. They're crying out of shame of their actions. They're crying out in the hope that has been offered in Jonah's brief message. How dare they? Who do they think they are? You terrible people. You can't just flip a switch like that. Jonah begins to walk a little bit faster. Well, he thinks to himself, words are only words. Surely God can see past that. As Jonah picks up his pace, somebody crosses right in front of him. Jonah bumps into them. Oh, excuse me, good sir, says the Ninevite. They turn around to look at Jonah, and he sees that they are wearing a sackcloth, covered themselves with ashes. What? That's a Hebrew thing. What are you doing, man? You can't just appropriate that piece of our culture and think God is going to forgive you. My sermon was the worst sermon ever. How can you even believe what I told you? Jonah begins pushing his way through the crowds, and again, after nearly a day's walk, he makes it to the city gate. Just as he's passing beyond the gate, he hears, bah, and he sees a soldier chasing a sheep around with a sackcloth. Jonah kind of stops, slowly walks backward, turns around just to make sure he's not hallucinating, and a soldier of Nineveh is chasing around a sheep with a sackcloth. These people are way weirder than I thought, he said. As Jonah is shaking his head, their squad leader appears in the doorway with an armful of sackcloths. Yes, the king was adamant about this. We are to put sackcloths on all the animals as well as ourselves. We have sinned against God, and now that we see that, maybe we can atone for it. At this point, Jonah is furious. What noobs, Jonah thinks to himself. Don't they know that the sackcloth only goes on people? Like that's going to save them. Am I right, God? However, the text leads us on to believe that God felt differently about Nineveh than Jonah did. And so Jonah goes atop the hill to wait the destruction of Nineveh with his bag of popcorn. And while this story is a comedy of sorts, we can't help but begin to wonder, who is the hero of this story? If you're like me, you might be thinking, I don't really think it's Jonah. I think that was kind of half-hearted proclamation. The hero is God, the God of the Hebrews who reaches out to the enemy and shows compassion. Jonah's journey up to this point raises another question. What is the point of your religion? I mean that. Many of us have been born into this faith, brought up on years of Sunday school and a sense of normalcy that says, well, you should be a Christian because that's what the majority of people around here do. Many of us haven't even had the opportunity to ask ourselves this question. What is the point of our religion? We see Jonah and his journey to Nineveh, and we might assume that it's about who's in and who's out. There is an us and them mentality that may not be undeserved by Jonah and the experience that his people have had, but it's certainly not what our scriptures teach us. For Jonah, it's about a sense of justice. I am a Hebrew, and I am entitled to the love of God. These Ninevites are not. I have done what it takes to be a good Hebrew, even going to Nineveh when God asked. These Ninevites, they're just jumping on the bandwagon because they know that the end is near. I have done everything required to be saved, and I am ready to feel that comfort, and also the comfort of those who haven't followed the rules, being led to destruction. I want that justice. If you feel uncomfortable with this sense of dualistic nature that Jonah's talking about, the us and them, the in and out thinking good, so am I. Have I ever told you that outside the church, I spend more time talking about what Christianity is not than what it is? The perception of the modern Christian is that we are judgmental, legalistic, condescending. My initial reaction to this is, ooh, but not me. But truth be told, I have been, and I can be if I let my guard down. Our human tendency is to make groups of us and them. Our tendency is to understand justice in its retributive sense, an eye for an eye. We talk about that a lot in Sunday school right now. Jonah's story liberates us from this presumption and brokenness. In this story, God invites us to be a part of this peacemaking process. The hopeful word that is preached to Nineveh half-heartedly is what is so desperately needed. With only this short sentence, and in the Hebrew, it is 5 words. I bet you wish I preached a 5-word sermon every Sunday. The modern day message may not be as dramatic as this message for Nineveh, repent or your city will be destroyed. The modern message that people are yearning for, as Keith so aptly suggested, is that you are accepted. You are loved. There is a place at the table for you. You are enough. You are beautifully and wonderfully made. God's invitation stands to invite others into your experience of the divine and to share that. The purpose of our religion is not to ball it up and hold it up within us, but to let God's love consume us and to share it with others. It is not a merit-based system that God keeps tallies in the sky above. It is about a system of transformation that doesn't simply begin and end, but is a journey, a process. If you have felt that love, then you know how desperately others need it as well. This isn't about a conversion. It's about the desire that others experience the same mercy, the same feeling, the same love. That doesn't mean that you go and try and convert others to your way of thinking. It means that in God's mercy, we have the tools to love. This might look like you sharing your faith with somebody, but it also might look like you simply finding a creative way to love a coworker, to love on a friend, to love a family member that you've been feuding with, or, dare I say, to love a stranger. In Jonah's story, our faith is directed back to this question: what is the purpose of your faith? Amen.